who's certified as AICP. He's a principal at Tyndall Oliver, Tampa, Florida. And he is also focused his career on multimodal mobility planning and traffic safety with a strong focus improving safety and mobility for non-motorized road users. He's managed district-wide safety contracts for FDOT, and he serves as an instructor and expert for the FHWA, Pedestrian Safety Focused City State Program. With that, I'm going to go through this short slide presentation on the Academy. And like I said earlier, this is the FDOT Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy. It was established to provide information on safety-related issues to enhance your local safety program. And we are in the 5th year of the Local Agency Safety Academy program. Started in January, and they are usually scheduled between 10 and 12 o'clock. I'll usually go about an hour to an hour and a half with questions and answers, but no more than 2 hours, and that will depend on the complexity of the topic. And I have listed here some links that Anthony kind of highlighted about registration and how you get to the web page. As I mentioned, today is pet safety at Signalized intersection, and then we have one more webinar for this remainder of this year on December 13th. And also, this webinar will be submitted for AICP credit for those that are certified as AICP members. And then also, if you are a professional engineer, you can request PDHs and just follow this information here. And also, I believe Anthony has it listed out here off to the side, the link to it. Also, if you have any questions, or you want to call me or email me, you can, and just ask me any question you might have about the Safety Academy. With that, I want to turn it over to Amy.
Show my screen. Hey, thank you, Dennis. Good to be here again. It's kind of a funny story. I actually was in the field 15 minutes ago looking at a signalized intersection with a group of folks from DOT in the city of Tampa, and then also quite a few residents from the Seminole Heights neighborhood, and jumped in my car and didn't break any laws to get here, certainly. And I'm excited to now talk about signalized intersections. This one is pretty easy because there is an exact module for this as part of the Federal Highway Administration's Designing for Pedestrian Safety workshop. So that made my job easier, but it's a little bit of a disclaimer for some of you. I was told by Alex Henry at DOT that there was a Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center webinar maybe a month ago that covered the same topic. So if you sat in that webinar, you may want to catch up on your emails for this one. I'm not trying to run off any business, but that's simply the truth. Anthony mentions that you guys can ask questions in the chat pod during, and if we get any questions as we go through, he'll stop me and ask those, and we can kind of talk about it a little bit. And feel free to do that. It'll make it more interesting for me, certainly, and probably more interesting for you, too. So with that, we're going to start talking about signalized intersections. And I guess one thing I'll mention, at the outset is that we want you to be able, by the end of this, be able to understand that traffic signals don't guarantee safety. They simply assign the right of way. And we can talk about that a little bit in terms of how that influences pedestrian behavior and some decision making about whether or not pedestrians do cross the signalized intersections. We'll talk some about signal timing and phasing techniques that help to make intersections, and we're going to use words like safer instead of safe, because absolute safety is kind of tough to guarantee. But we can talk about timing and phasing techniques, about how you operate your traffic signals to improve conditions for pedestrians, and then talk about some of the major threats and risks at signalized intersections. And also, with that, sort of a specific discussion on protected turns. If there's something that you want to know about signalized intersections that we don't cover in the webinar, be sure to ask it at the end or ask it when you think we get close. If it's something we're going to cover, we'll just let you know that it's coming up. When we do the 2-day workshop for Federal Highway, we also talk about the geometric design of intersections and how all of those things influence safety, how we can use refuge islands, whether it's a refuge island in the median, which we don't have too many of in Florida, or a refuge island between the right turn lane and the through lanes to help make signalized intersections less intimidating. We typically would also talk about how crosswalk locations are important, and that deals with both minimizing the distance pedestrians have to cross, but probably more importantly, making sure that there are good sight triangles between approaching drivers and pedestrians. Also, generally, we'll talk about street lighting. Florida DOT, a couple years ago, picked up on some analysis and research that Federal Highway did to talk about lighting at mid-block crossings, and then took that design guidance and applied that to come up with a new signalized intersection lighting standard for basically urban locations that have not necessarily high pedestrian crashes, but high activity. And certainly if they have high crashes, then they would meet the criteria as well. And so throughout Florida, you'll see in the next few years, DOT programming projects on state highways to improve lighting at signalized intersections, specifically to better illuminate the crosswalk areas. And so that's a real big deal for us, and a neat thing to be able to move forward with. And then we're also going to talk about proper push button location, and a little bit we'll talk about when you automatically get the walk signal versus when you have to push the button to get it, and then also looking at ways to reduce conflicts with turning vehicles. But the first couple of these are things that we're not going to talk too much about today, but may have been discussed in other local agency Traffic Safety Academy webinars, or certainly in various Federal Highway webinars. The first point that we're making here is that traffic signals assign the right of way. They regulate flow of traffic. And one thing that's interesting about this, and we would like our signal timing engineers to think more about, is that they create gaps in traffic, not just at the signalized intersection, but they create gaps downstream of them. And so the way that we time and operate our traffic signals have both an influence on safety at the traffic signal and on safety adjacent to the traffic signal. And I'm not saying pedestrian safety, I'm saying overall traffic safety, because of course, while you have pedestrians trying to cross the street, you also have motor vehicle traffic that's maybe making left turns out of side street locations or driveways, or doing other maneuvers like that. And so one of the things that we know is that a dense grid of signals that is operating, and let me define some terms. I think most of the people, this is sort of a more of a professional audience, but let me define some terms that we're going to use throughout. We have cycle length, which is the total time it takes for a signal to go through all of the phases. And then we also have phasing, which talks about the order in which the signal operates and sort of what sort of arrows you get, left turn, right turn. And Anthony, my traffic engineer friend, is sort of squinting as I explain these in layman's terms. And then we have the timing of the signal, the splits, how much time is awarded or given to each of the movements, each of the conflicting movements. So we're going to be using some of these terms throughout. But one thing I'd like to say globally is that in Florida in general, and more so in the I-4 corridor up through maybe Jacksonville, but Metro Orlando, Tampa Bay, Southwest Florida, the duration of our overall signal cycle lengths is really beyond the pale. It is really exceptional compared to what we would find nationally in major metropolitan areas. And even it's become significantly longer than what the standard practice is in Southeast Florida, in the Fort Lauderdale, Broward area, Miami-Dade, which you could certainly make the argument that they have as much or more traffic than we do. And that has a chilling influence on the ability to basically hang in there and wait for the signal and cross as a pedestrian at signalized intersections, but also, particularly outside of the immediate peak rush hour, has a negative effect on how well traffic is organized moving up and down our arterial corridors, which then reduces the frequency and quality of gaps for pedestrians and motorists to cross the street away from signalized locations. And so that's something that I want to point out. We don't get into that too much in the slide, but I think that we need to think of traffic signals not as a point feature that only influence the intersection of signalized, but as a systems feature that influence the way the entire arterial grid behaves. So with that, I'm going to move along. Assuming, which is a big assumption, that everyone is obeying the traffic signals, so the pedestrians are only walking during the walk phase and motorists are not running the red light, or they're not making imprudent right turns on red. When we assume this, which is not really a safe assumption, but the biggest conflicts are the turning movements. And basically you have right turns and left turns. Of these two, the left turn movement is more deadly, more dangerous, results in higher severity of crashes. And that's simply a function of the left turn movement typically being a higher speed movement. It's a larger radius than the right turn movement, and frequently it's a function of a car trying to turn left and get out of the way of oncoming traffic, which makes them tend to want to go fast from a self-preservation standpoint. Traffic signals don't ensure protection, and pedestrians pretty routinely ignore traffic signals. And sometimes, I'm not saying it's okay, but sometimes they can do it safely. Our office is in downtown Tampa. You can walk around downtown, and certain streets, you better make sure you've got the walk signal. But the lower speed, lower volume streets, oftentimes there's no cars for days in either direction, and you could scoot across as long as you're paying attention and probably be perfectly safe. And so this is an issue that we deal with, and it's kind of tough sometimes for people to figure out when it's probably reasonably safe to ignore the traffic signal and when it's really probably a very dangerous thing to do. The other thing is that pedestrians are going to cross where it's convenient. Pedestrians and cyclists as well, but especially pedestrians' aversion to out-of-direction travel is very significant simply because they don't move very fast. That's the main reason. It takes a pedestrian a long time to go a couple hundred feet out of the way. If we think about acceptable delay at a traffic signal, I think, was it 80 seconds of delay is getting to be pretty bad for a driver. And so we can do some math and we can say how far can a pedestrian walk in 80 seconds if we divide that with 4 feet per second. Yep. So that's about 250 feet. So the amount of delay that we would consider to be unacceptable for a driver at a traffic signal equates to about a 250-foot out of direction walk for a pedestrian. Now, if they're trying to get directly across the street, that's really 125 feet on each side of the street, plus whatever signal delay they would incur. So if we're thinking about level of service in terms of delay and convenience, very quickly, when we start asking pedestrians to walk out of direction, go out of their way basically to cross at a controlled location, we're introducing a delay factor for them that, really from a motor vehicle standpoint, we would classify as being unacceptable. I'm not saying that to say that pedestrians should not walk out of the way to preserve their own life, but simply to help explain their oftentimes motivation for not doing it. I think the other point I'd like to make here is people are not very good at processing risk when the odds are extreme or that the outcomes are extreme. If I went to any one of you, if I said to Anthony, hey, Anthony, I'll flip you a coin for $1, he could do that math and he could assess his reward and his risk very easily. He's either standing to lose or gain $1, and it's a 50-50 shot. And I don't have $1 or a coin, but that's something that we could do. But if I said to you, hey, are you going to play the lottery? When you're playing the lottery, the outcomes are extreme. The upside outcome is extreme. The downside outcome, the buy-in is relatively inexpensive. And the odds are also incalculable. You can do it on paper, you can do it with a calculator, but it really doesn't mean anything to you. If I said your odds of winning are 1 in a million, or I said your odds of winning are 1 in 10 million, it's the same thing to you. It's an astronomical odd with a ludicrous payoff. And I'd even make the case is that when you buy a lottery ticket, you're not really buying a 1 in whatever chance of winning, you're buying the right to think about what you would do with the money. That's what you're really buying. Well, the same thing is true when pedestrians cross sort of at their own risk. The odds of them actually getting hit are really pretty low. They could make that unsignalized or uncontrolled crossing every day of their life on their way to work or on their way to the bus or on their way to wherever they're going. And they could probably do it for years and years and years and not get hit. So it's a kind of a high odds against the bad outcomes, kind of the opposite of a lottery. But if they do get hit, the outcome is very extreme. So what I would say to you is that, and the cost is pretty well known. The cost is, I'm going to delay by 5 minutes to go walk down to the signal. I'm going to do that. So I'm going to pay this cost every day against a very, very low probability that if I keep doing what I'm doing, I won't get hit. And so I would make the case to you that when pedestrians are making bad decisions in traffic, it's really similar from a intellectual process or a risk management process as to playing a lottery. It's more like playing a lottery than it is like tossing a coin for a dollar bet. And so when we watch people's behavior and we say, well, that's inexplicable, it doesn't make sense, why would you risk your life? It's because they don't really think that they are. They think that those odds are so long that they're incalculable. And statistically, they're probably right. It's just that they're wrong too many times, too often. So part of our job as engineers and planners or whatever it is that we do is trying to figure out ways, and we can't always do it. We can't do it perfectly, but figuring out ways to make the convenient thing also the safe thing. That can mean providing more places to cross at controlled locations. It can mean reducing traffic speeds so that when somebody does make an unwise choice, everyone has more time to respond and react. It can mean improving roadway lighting so that when people do these things at night, everybody has a better chance to avoid that fatal or severe injury outcome. So again, starting from sort of the big picture, getting down into the minutia, and believe me, by the time we get done, we're going to deal with some minutia this morning. We have red light running, which is a risk to pedestrians. More often than not, when a pedestrian is hit by a through vehicle at a traffic signal, it's usually the pedestrian that has disregarded the traffic signal, but certainly there are cases where it's the driver that ran the red light as well. A lot of times we can have a situation where maybe the pedestrian, maybe they left during the flashing don't walk or during the countdown part and didn't make it all the way across and sort of got stranded out there and had to bolt for it. And that's one of the reasons we'll talk in a little bit about why the countdown signals are so important. But the other challenge we see, we always talk about, the red light running, but you have left turns on green, and then also right turns on green are a risk as well. And so all of these are these conflicting movements, but it's the left and right turns on green where the driver has the green, but the pedestrian formally has the right of way. That can be a challenge. I don't know if this video will play, but this is sort of an example of a red light running. This is an extreme case. See if I can get it to work. It says codec is unavailable, so we're going to not crash the PowerPoint. We'll skip this. But basically in this video, you have people crossing. Can they see my mouse, Anthony? No?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
You basically have people crossing through here, and they're crossing with the green. This traffic is moving, and somebody comes flying through here and very nearly kills everyone. It's pretty dramatic. So I mentioned before making the convenient thing the safe thing. So how do we make just operating the traffic signal convenient? And these are some things we can do. Good push button placement, making that intuitive, thinking about placement of signal heads so that they're obvious what's going on, timing, countdown signals, and then opportunities to use technology to make the whole thing work a little bit better. I would say that unless the signal has been built or rebuilt in the last maybe 7 or 8, 10 years, odds are that the push buttons, and in some cases even then, odds are that the push buttons are probably not compliant with MUTCD. And a lot of what the MUTCD is queuing off of is really the ADA. But the idea is that they're in line with the crosswalk so that as you're walking towards the crosswalk, you could basically reach out and tap the button. They should be at least 10 feet apart. A lot of times we see them where they're both mounted on a signal pole, so that would not be appropriate. They should be between 1.5 and 6 feet from the curb, so not too close or not too far away from the curb. And the face of the button should be parallel to the crosswalk. So again, sort of physically, the physical orientation of the push button ought to explain what crosswalk it relates to, so that without signs or any other supplemental instruction, it's intuitive how the thing works. Now, this is easier to do in Photoshop than it is in real life. Typically, I would say that our radii at our signalized intersections in Tampa Bay are usually much bigger than this, and a lot of times we have a lot more junk in them. We've got giant, hurricane-proof signal mast arms, controller cabinets, utilities, right-of-way encroachments, all sorts of things that can make this very, very challenging. But if we were trying to, design it perfectly, this is what we'd be looking for. So this is sort of taking the same set of criteria and applying that from a plan view, from an aerial view. And so you see that hashed beige or tan area is the area where we'd like to put our push buttons. So they shouldn't be in the ramps, minimum and maximum distance from the face of the curb. And then, generally a level areas, so that if you're a person who's in a wheelchair or using some other mobility device, that you're not putting yourself at risk. And the idea is that place where you push the push button ought to also be the level landing where you wait to cross. And so we're trying to coordinate both the intuitiveness of the button placement and then also the ADA requirements. There you go. Of course, we see things like this. Sometimes we hide them. It's sort of a Where's Waldo kind of situation. They can be too far from the ramp, which for a person that doesn't have any mobility impairments, that may not be that big of an issue. But if you're in a wheelchair or even just a slow walker, we time our pedestrian intervals based on the width of the crossing, but also making some assumptions about how far the push button is considered to be the start of the crossing, not the edge of pavement. And so if your push buttons are too far from the ramp, that's where we're telling people to wait to cross, then you may find yourself in a situation where now your pedestrian interval is not adequate. We can put them behind barriers, things like that, vegetation. These are kind of a little bit extreme examples, but they do exist. Just where they're not in an intuitive location, where they're not, lined up with your route. Here, somebody put this pole in at 90 degrees. And this is actually a local example. I'm not sure exactly where this is, but this is in Hillsborough County somewhere. And this is what I would call the come on, man. Like, really? Fixing this is not, in this case, you've got, mulch and dirt. So putting in that conduit for that sort of supplemental pedestal and device is probably, you're not out there with a concrete saw cutting through pavement. But in some cases, that is what's necessary. You make your cut, put in some conduit, and then put that little supplemental pedestal away from, basically jump it over there. So these are better examples on the side of the pole in the direction you're traveling, at the top of the ramp on a level landing. This is kind of what we prefer to see out there. When you go and press the crosswalk button, you press it and you pray or you think happy thoughts or whatever your tradition is. When you press the button in an elevator, it lights up and it lets you know, hey, gotcha, on the way. And so that's something that we think is a good adaptation for crosswalks, to at least provide that feedback that lets the pedestrian know, hey, got the message, we're working on it, you're going to get your walk signal. I've often thought sometimes that people think that pedestrian push buttons are pneumatic because they'll push them about 1,000 times just to make sure, and that probably has a long-term maintenance wear and tear issue. So there may be even some maintenance advantages to providing that feedback, since maybe your push button doesn't get pushed 1,000 times a day. So it's kind of a common sense thing that let's make it work like an elevator. In terms of the legend, the idea is that more and more we try to go with pictograms, but basically the idea is that we're explaining how it works to people, and using the signs as a supplement to help with the intuitiveness of the location. Pedestrian signal heads, those should be at signalized intersections. I think for the most part in Tampa Bay we've got that. There may be a couple of signals out in rural areas where they're not there. I believe that DOT's policy, at least, is even if they're putting a signal in a rural location that doesn't have sidewalks, they will go ahead and put in the pedestrian features at the intersection. So they'll put in the pedestrian signal heads, they'll put in the push buttons, and they'll put in the ADA ramps, just waiting for somebody in the future to show up with a sidewalk, so that at least that basic infrastructure is in there. But that didn't used to be the case, and so there may be some legacy locations that don't have the features. But the preference is that if we have a traffic signal, we have a pedestrian signal head. Where they don't exist, pedestrians, most pedestrians will figure out to go with the regular signal head and then cross with that concurrent green. But this doesn't always work out. This could be especially a problem on a one-way street where you can't see the signal head. And just some locations where maybe there's left turn phasing or something like that, it may not be the same right of way as for the motor vehicles. Pedestrian signal head placement is important, 7 to 10 feet high, and you really want to place them close to the curb ramp, where they're not so far away, where they're intuitive. And then it's really important that they're more or less in line with the crosswalk. I'm going to make a little bit of fun of the city of Tampa, because I know that a couple of their staff at least are on the field right now and they won't hear me. But when Zach Street, Avenue of the Arts, was redone, which is a beautiful street, the pedestrian ramps and crosswalks were shifted inward because curb extensions were more commonly bulb outs were installed as part of that project. By all extents and purposes, that was a wonderful project for pedestrians and a nice downtown streetscaping project. But when those crosswalks were shifted inward, I noticed that the pedestrian signals at some locations were not also shifted. So you're walking along this wonderful sidewalk, and then you come to the crosswalk, and it's not really obvious to you where the signal head is, and you may believe maybe that it's unsignalized location and just kind of wander out into it. So this is an example of making sure that they're lined up. In this, we don't have many or possibly any two-stage pedestrian crossings in Tampa Bay area. They do exist throughout the country, and frankly, they're a pretty good idea when you have big, complicated intersections. We could probably stand to think about that more, but particularly when you have a two-stage crossing, it's really important that the pedestrian signal heads are offset and aimed, and can even be louvered or using LEDs to make them a little bit directional, so that pedestrians don't cue off the wrong signal head in a two-stage crossing. So in this example, the pedestrians have the walk signal to cross the second part of the intersection, but not the first part. And the couple here looks like they might just keep on going because maybe it's not lined up correctly for them. Accessible pedestrian signals, something that we primarily think about for pedestrians with visual impairment, but we expect that in the next edition of the MUTCD, these will become the new standard, similar to the way that the countdown pedestrian signals have become the new standard. So as we do new installations or capital maintenance, the requirement will become to either install or retrofit to these. What they do is they provide audible and a vibrotactile message to the pedestrians, and they really do provide some redundancy for all pedestrians, not just pedestrians with visual impairments, and that's why it's going to the overall thing. The speakers are at the push button, and there's two basic components to this. There's a locator tone, which helps someone locate the push button. And that sounds, if you have sound on, a little bit like this. It's a kind of a low beep. The tactile arrow, the raised arrow, explains the direction that the pedestrian push button controls the crossing for. And these things will have an automatic volume adjustment. So think of a noise canceling headphone. They have a microphone that's listening to ambient noise, and then they're adjusting the volume of the locator tone so that it's audible within about 6 to 12 feet of the button. So someone that's visually impaired will use the guide dog or their normal process with cane or whatever to follow the sidewalk to the intersection. And then from that point forward, the locator tone will help guide them in to the push button. And that's so that it doesn't become a noise pollution factor, maybe for businesses or residents in the vicinity. If you can imagine 24/7 beeping that you can hear from your front porch, that'd be pretty annoying. But the location, of course, then is critical to the proper functioning. If we've not done the push button location things that we talked about before, then none of this really matters. And so that's why if you have to retrofit to an accessible pedestrian signal, but your pedestrian push buttons are not accessible, or they're in a poor location to begin with, now you're not sending somebody out to swap out a little box and a button. You're going to do a much bigger project. But it should have both audible and vibrotactile walk indications. It can be a tone or speech that says, cross whatever now. Tone is maybe better if you're talking about, not everyone speaks English. If it's speech, you typically have to pick a language. And so a tone, I would suggest, is maybe more universal, particularly in Florida, where we have people speaking a lot of different languages, both folks that live here and tourists. And then the walk indication also has a particular vibration during the walk phase. Okay, moving along, we're getting now into the phasing conversation about, how your walk indication for pedestrians comes up or doesn't come up. The term we're using here is recall to walk, which is sort of the signal timing phrase, but what that means is that the walk signal comes up automatically. What we would like to see in high-use crosswalk areas, a pedestrian should automatically get the walk signal for every cycle. The reason for this is that if you arrive a little bit late, or maybe you don't know you have to push the button or you don't do it, now you've missed the walk. You see the green for the cars, you don't get the walk signal. You try to guess and go with the green phase for the automobiles, but if there are left turning phases, that can be confusing for you. You don't know how much time you have left, or you may just give up and maybe you realize too late that you didn't get the walk signal and you go anyway, but you're towards the end of the cycle. So all sorts of kind of unsafe behaviors or less safe behaviors can occur if you miss that walk signal. And so when we know we're probably going to have pedestrians, maybe it's every other cycle or most of the time, then we definitely want to provide that to come up automatically. Typically, what we see, both nationally and really in Florida, is that the pedestrian movement that's along the major street, the A street, the walk comes up automatically with the through green. And the pedestrian movement that's along the minor street, you have to push the button. If you guys were in the same room with me, I'd ask somebody to say why. You're not, so I'm going to just go ahead and tell you. The reason for this is 9 times out of 10, the green time for the through movement on the major road is at least as long as the minimum walk plus clearance for the pedestrian movement. And so there's absolutely no sacrifice on the performance of the roadway for motor vehicle traffic by providing that pedestrian phase with every through green phase, and doesn't impact the motor vehicle traffic. For the minor street movement, often but not always, the major street is pretty wide. It might be 3 lanes in each direction, maybe a right turn lane, maybe 2 left turn lanes. Now you're talking about 100 feet of pavement, 100 divided by 3.5 plus, clearance plus a little bit on either end is maybe 35 seconds of minimum walk interval. And oftentimes that's significantly longer than what we're providing for the concurrent through green motor vehicle movement. That means that when we have a pedestrian call, it's going to throw that signal out of coordination, and that can have delay impacts for the motor vehicle traffic that we're trying to move along the main line. A couple of things on this. A lot of times we have 2 streets that are both major streets, 2 arterial streets intersecting, and it's pretty damn arbitrary which one we call the major and which one we call the minor. When we're doing road safety audits, when we're talking about pedestrian safety action plans, when we're trying to generally make conditions better for pedestrians, what we would say is that if your motor vehicle concurrent through green movement is longer than your pedestrian minimum clearance, minimum phase, there's really no reason not to have the walk come up automatically. It's not going to hurt anything. The other thing is it's confusing as all get out for pedestrians when they automatically get the walk crossing one leg and then they have to push a button to get it crossing the other way, when for all intents and purposes all 4 legs of the intersection look about the same to them. It's just not intuitive. And so they'll sometimes not push the button, and then they don't get the walk signal, and then they go do something stupid.
Would you say it's a good idea when you have minimum recall to have the tactile feedback button, even if it sets a recall, just to train pedestrians to push the button?
Yeah, I think that I don't know all of the reasons why they've made the accessible pedestrian signal, why they anticipate making it the new standard, but that may be one of them, is that it helps to remind people, hey, you need to push the button. The other thing we could talk about also is how our signals operate peak versus off-peak time period. So there may be a very, very valid case where you don't want to call the walk signal for the minor street automatically during peak traffic, but maybe late at night, early in the morning, maybe it doesn't matter as much. And so these are some things, I'm not saying that's a good idea necessarily, but doing everything always the same way and not being responsive to conditions or time of day doesn't always get us the best outcomes. Thinking about timing and walking speeds, shorter cycle lengths are better. Unfortunately, I've heard that in some cases, the absurd duration of our 4-minute, in some cases, cycle lengths are being driven by the fact that the minimum pedestrian intervals are so long, particularly when we have those 2 major roads. I don't know if I fully buy that or not. I'll have to go look at some timing plans and see if that's BS or not. But as a rule, everyone's compliance goes up when there's less wait time. One of the issues we're going to have with long cycle lengths, not so much a problem in most of suburban Florida, but maybe in downtown areas, is that pedestrians tend to pile up when you have a long wait. And so then that can cause crowding. I think, this is a national presentation. I don't see this being too big of an issue in Florida because, we have more of, sort of less pedestrian volume, but in a downtown, this may be something to consider. Since the 2003 to the 2009 MUTCD, there's been some changes. Old requirements, tell you what, let's skip the old requirements because it's been a long time since 2003 and just talk about the new requirements. There's a minimum of a 7-second walk. The pedestrian clearance should now be calculated at 3.5 feet per second, curb to curb. And so the way this comes out is if the crosswalk is 60 feet, think about it, that's a 4-lane road with a 2-way left turn lane, basically. That's a 60-foot road. So the crosswalk, 60 divided by 3.5, you round up as 17 seconds, plus 7 is a 24-second total. So 7 seconds of walk, and then you'd have a 17-second countdown. But you do an additional test for the walk plus the clearance time, and that's calculated from the push buttons. So it's 6 feet from the curb if no button to the curb. What the hell does this say? 6 feet from the curb if no button to curb on other side of 3 seconds. Anyway, basically you add 6 feet. And so it's 6 feet plus 60 is 66, divided by 3.5 is 22, and then you take the greater of the two numbers. And so the alternate test is really maybe more for smaller intersections, basically is what that comes down to. But that's how it's calculated. And I think the main thing to point out here is that the average American pedestrian has gotten a little bit slower. And so it used to be 4 seconds, and now it's 3.5 feet per, used to be 4 feet per second, now it's 3.5 feet per second. Sorry. Again, mentioning that the push button is considered to be the departure point. And so that's where you get that sort of alternative test. So it's the 6 feet plus to the other curb for your minimum. And usually I think in Florida where our streets tend to be wider, it's going to be the first one, the 7 plus width divided by 3.5. Used to be we had walk, flashing don't walk, and then a solid don't walk. And most people didn't understand it. I would like to give credit to Florida DOT District 7. Over a decade ago, I think that they were willing to have a unmarked, utility truck back up to your local maintenance yard and unload a pallet of countdown pedestrian inserts for local maintenance forces to install. And so I can go down to Fort Lauderdale, where I'm going to be tomorrow, and in their downtown, they won't have countdown pedestrian signals. Although they are aggressively implementing Vision Zero, so I expect that they will have those everywhere very soon. But in Tampa Bay, we've been lucky that we've enjoyed the luxury of those for over a decade now. However, that is a new standard, and it's a new, DOT has adopted that as a standard. So as DOT does maintenance, and really as everyone is doing maintenance, we ought to be updating to these things. The main thing was that the more information you provide to people, the better decisions they can make, and the flashing don't walk simply didn't tell you how much time you had to get across. So with the new system, which I think new is maybe when these PowerPoints were made was new, but it's not new anymore, you know exactly how much time you have. Now, if you begin crossing after the countdown starts, technically you could be cited. I've met a lot of different police officers, and I've not really met anyone that's likely to cite you unless you just completely impede traffic as you go across. If you are someone that doesn't move as fast, you know that you need that full countdown period to get across the intersection. If you're willing to kind of run for it at the end, you might be able to look at an intersection like this, have 6 or 7 seconds left, and easily jog across and still make it before you create a conflict. And so providing that feedback is really critical to people making good decisions. This is in Mexico, a little bit different. The way they do it, it gives you the countdown and it shows you just kind of walking across, bold, and then, hey, you might want to move a little faster. Hey, you need to hustle. Better run. All right, and so that's sort of a different way to do it. But I think we all get the message as there's a few seconds left. We need to get through it. These have been out there, as I said, for over a decade, so we've had time to study them. They're intuitive for pedestrians. What we find is that more people start crossing during the countdown. So, technically more people are breaking the law. But what we care about really is the outcome, and that's that fewer people start walking late in the clearance phase, and very few people are walking when the don't walk has come on. So you're at the yellow and then red for the drivers. And the other thing that we found is that they have an overall crash reduction benefit on the intersection, not just for pedestrians and cyclists too, but for motor vehicles. Drivers use these to say, you know what, I'm just not going to make that one. Even from a distance, you may not be able to read the actual numbers, but you can usually tell if it's down to single digits. And so what we find, and it's a party line whether it's true or not, is that people don't use these as a cue to accelerate and beat the light. People basically use them as a cue to take their foot off the gas and come to a stop. But I would put out there to you that even if someone is saying, oh shoot, I'm running out of time, I better gun it, they're making the light. They're making it on a green or on a yellow, not on a red, which is still, if they're not going too fast, it's still safer. And so the basic philosophy in traffic safety is if you provide good, actionable information to people, they will make better decisions.
And on that, I think the opposite is true as well, that if I'm far enough away from an intersection and it's green, but I see 3, 2, 1, and there's no possible way, I'd let go of the gas and start coasting.
And that's what we're finding happens. More often people are using it to, save a little bit of gas, take it easy. So that's nice. So again, San Francisco study, overall crash reduction, not just for pedestrians. Countdown display is required most of the time, and there again, because there's a benefit. And we may have a slide later, but I can't remember, so I want to mention something. And this is frustrating to me because we tend to do it one way on one side of the bay and the other way on the other side of the bay. We would really like to see the full interval given to the pedestrian. So in other words, if the minimum pedestrian interval is, let's say, 35 seconds, but the through green for the motor vehicle traffic is 45 seconds, the preference would be that instead of 7 seconds of walk, and can I do this math even? I messed it up. So 7 seconds, I said 35 minus 7 is what? 23? 28. Instead of 7 seconds, I got it. I did it in my head. Instead of 7 seconds of walk and 28 seconds of countdown, if we've got another 10 seconds of through green for the motor vehicle, we'd like to see is 17 seconds of walk. It's really confusing for pedestrian when they're looking at a don't walk, but there's still a green for the traffic. And so that puts us back in that old way of doing business where the pedestrian's going, well, maybe I could go, but I'm not really sure how much time I have to get across. It starts leading the bolder pedestrians out into a trap. The best, I'm kind of grinning when I say it, the best reason I've heard where someone says, well, we go ahead and just give them the minimum and then terminate it and then leave the light green is because the light has a detector for an emergency vehicle, and they want to be able to cycle quickly if they need an emergency vehicle coming through the corridor. And I'm going like, I understand what you're doing, but at the same time, we're trying to prevent the need for the ambulance in the first place. And so it's kind of like, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And it's also really confusing when we do things one way in one jurisdiction, and then you drive across the jurisdictional boundary and things go a different way. The same way that drivers are using the countdown signals to kind of understand what's going on with it. Drivers don't know when they cross a city limit line, and they don't necessarily get. I think when they cross the bay, they know they've gone between counties, but to them, it's the roadway system. It's not. Oh, I'm in Tampa, and I'm in Clearwater, now I'm in wherever. And so the best practice from our point of view is to go ahead and let the pedestrian have the full benefit of that concurrent green phase. A reason why you wouldn't do that in a downtown area is sometimes you have so much pedestrian traffic that you actually can't make the right and the left turn movements. And so you really do want those pedestrians they get to go, and then you stop them so that some of the drivers can turn right and left. But that's a pretty exceptional situation. And when I see it done where the pedestrian has a don't walk and the concurrent through green might be going on for another 20, 30 seconds, is usually in suburban areas, not in the downtown. And I really would like for the folks that are doing that to reconsider that policy, because it sends really bad mixed messages to both drivers and pedestrians.
St. Petersburg would like to chime in with that and say thank you for saying that, because that's their policy, and they like
Yeah.
It's implemented, it works great.
And I'll just say it one more time that that's considered to be the national best practice. So new requirement, overall good benefit. We've had a little discussion here already, and we can bring it back at the end. One of the things we want to talk about is using technology to sort of optimize what we're doing. We use 3.5 feet per second as sort of that. It's sort of the not really the straight mean of pedestrian walking speeds, but kind of that first standard deviation. So we're accommodating maybe 85% of the walking public with that 3.5 foot per second standard for our timing. But then that means that there's, maybe 7, 8, 10, 15% that are slower than that. If we take all of our signals and say, well, we've got maybe a little bit older demographic, whatever it is, let's go with 3 feet per second. Now every cycle length, we're taking that hit. We're extending our overall cycle lengths, which have negative effects I've already talked about. So it's not something you necessarily want to deal with the outliers on every single phase. So what we can do is we can use whether it's video detection or infrared to basically understand that, I had a pedestrian call. And again, this is probably going to be something that's more on that minor movement walk interval where we really are sensitive to how much time we're taking away from the arterial. So I've got a pedestrian call. I know that somebody's going to want to be trying to cross, and we can use our technology to track that person as they come across the crosswalk. And so the idea here is that they're watching the crosswalk, they're tracking the pedestrian, and they can extend that walk interval a little bit. So you time it to the standard timing, but if you have that outlier pedestrian, that 5-10% of your people coming across, then you can give them more time. Basically, you add a 4-second block. If they haven't finished, then you can maybe do another 4 seconds. And like any sort of, for those of you that deal with signal timing, you can think of it as sort of dilemma zone preemption in reverse. Eventually, it times out. But what we found here is that the walk phase was prolonged. This was a Portland study. About 20% of the time, it needed to give the pedestrians a little bit more time. But there was therefore an 80% reduction in the delay for motor vehicles if you had just always used a longer interval. So that's something to consider. And again, that may be situational. It may be, based on you can analyze your demographics. Maybe you've got hospitals nearby. I know some locations in Tampa where we've got housing that's specifically for the elderly. It could be different reasons. It's sort of like the no right turn on red, the leading pedestrian interval. It's one of those things that's more of a case-by-case thing that you do, but it definitely has benefits. Looking at turning movements, nationally what we find is that the left turn is 2 to 1. And I think, there may be crashes or incidents with the right turning vehicle, or maybe the pedestrian gets brushed by the car or even knocked down. They're not injured, and they're typically what we find is that, and I've seen people go around and say, only half of motor vehicle crashes have injury, but 95% of pedestrian crashes have injury. Well, no, it's not necessarily true. You just don't report them if you're not hurt. There's no damage to the car. If the pedestrian's not damaged, it's not a crash as far as we know. It's just two people yelled at each other a little bit, and one of them went home mad and maybe a little bruised. But so I'm not necessarily saying that maybe right turn conflicts are at least as common as left turn, but they're less likely to result in a reportable crash or less likely to result in an injury. Main countermeasures here are thinking about your left turn phasing, protected, where you have the green arrow and then it's a red arrow and you cannot go, versus permissive, where you have maybe a green arrow, maybe not, but you're either turning on a green ball, so you can make a left turn if you can do it safely, or the flashing yellow is a permissive condition. You can think about no turn on red, but the other thing that we find to be at least as big a challenge is the right turn on green. we were debating an incident that happened earlier today where there was a tractor trailer that made a right turn on green and pedestrian crossing right turn on green, and the back axles of the tractor trailer dragged across and ran over the pedestrian. And it's real debatable whether or not who basically went first and had the control of the intersection. And in the absence of credible witnesses, it's tough to tell. There are opportunities where exclusive pedestrian phases make sense, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and then leading pedestrian interval, and we've actually got a couple here in the region. We can talk about that. One thing we've done is at locations where we know that along the corridor we have sort of an elevated crash history, is we'll just remind people of their obligation to yield to pedestrians. That's the R10-15 sign, and these can be, mostly you see these to remind people to yield to pedestrians when they're turning right, but you can also use these in a left turn situation. And again, we've gone more to the pictogram than to all the words. You can use an LED if you're real serious, but that costs a lot more. And these can be mounted on the overhead, you know, if it's a newer signal and you feel good about the structure, but more often you see them mounted on a sign pole at the side of the road there. Protected versus left turn. Protected left turns reduce all crashes, you know, reduce left turning crashes and then also pedestrian crashes. This is what we're talking about, a permissive turn, green, cars go, the pedestrian starts, and then the left turning traffic goes. When we show this little illustration, we show it with the pedestrian crossing from the same direction of the car, because that's more dangerous. If the pedestrian is here and is crossing, odds are that this driver is at least aware that they exist. And as they start their turn, they'll see the pedestrian crossing. In fact, odds are that by the time they get a gap from traffic, if this pedestrian was going the other way, they may already be through the receiving lanes for a left turn. So really the threat is when it's the same direction. And what we see is that this driver, not because they're a bad person, but simply because they are a human, is concerned about the threat to them. What's like me, what's the same size, what's dangerous to me, and that's motor vehicle traffic approaching from this direction. They are obligated to yield to this pedestrian, but may not even be aware that they exist in the first place because they're fixated on this cone of vision, looking for a gap. When the roadway is relatively congested, relatively saturated, this gap may be very small. So they may be chirping a tire and really kind of making this movement pretty quick. When they see this pedestrian and there's approaching traffic, oftentimes they will decide to try to either drive in front of or behind the pedestrian rather than stop and risk being hit or, God forbid, honked at and shamed by oncoming traffic, which is probably, to be honest, the more likely outcome. I read a crash report once where the driver started a left turn, the driver was turning left on a green ball, the pedestrian was crossing on a walk or maybe a flashy don't walk, and the driver says, as I started turning, the pedestrian ran in front of my car. I hit them, they got up and yelled at me and then collapsed and later died. And what happened was the driver's turning at the last minute, sees the pedestrian and tries to steer around the front of him. The pedestrian sees the driver and tries to run for safety. You know, and it's the squirrel effect. Is the squirrel going to finish crossing or run back to where they came from? And from the pedestrian's point of view, the nearest point of safety was the curve. And it's a 2x2 matrix. If the driver had gone behind and the pedestrian had gone forward, there wouldn't have been a crash. If the driver had gone in front and the pedestrian had stopped or run back, there wouldn't have been a crash. But in this case, they both chose the same square, and the pedestrian yelled some and then died. And so this is the challenge of this type of situation. I would mention that if this driver feels like they need to be in a hurry to squeak between these cars, you are also risking left turn crashes.
There's a question about a clarification.
Sure.
Regarding the Florida statutes. We're a stop for pedestrians in crosswalk, but you showed a picture of an R10-15 that's a yield to pedestrians.
Yeah, this is what you would use at a signalized intersection. And so it's a concurrent movement, and all you're doing is you're reminding. This is typically used against to remind people turning right on green to yield to pedestrians. And so that stop versus yield law applies more to mid-block crosswalks. Yeah, and so that's the reason why you would do that here. Here, there's not. It's a different condition. It's signal controlled. It's a different set of criterion rules that apply.
Yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, if not, we can come back to it at the end. So protected turn. Let's see. Keep going here. Protected turns are different. Typically the cars go first. We can do them lagging, where the pedestrian and the through traffic goes first. That's nice for pedestrians. Also, sometimes it helps you coordinate your arterial movements better. I would guess that when we do lagging protected turns, 99% of the time it's for coordination, not to be kind to pedestrians, but still, it's okay. But basically, the protected movement eliminates the threat of a conflict for both the pedestrians and also the drivers versus the through traffic. I would encourage you all, if you're trying to get protected left turns for your pedestrians, it's probably going to be really tough to show that there's a specific crash pattern with pedestrians. It's sort of a random event, but when it occurs, it is deadly. I would go and look at my motor vehicle crash patterns, and that might be an easier, if you've sort of got a retrograde agency policy, I would look at my motor vehicle crashes as a way to help in that justification. The other thing I'll mention, I think, and then protected permissive is better for traffic because you let the drivers go through, but really still presents, I'm jumping the gun here with a slide. These guys go, but then you're back to the same old threat as what you have here. A solution we have that we've implemented awkwardly, I guess, or maybe only partially implemented in most of Florida, is the 4-section left turn signal. This has got the flashing yellow arrow that more and more of these are becoming common. What's a little frustrating for me is that the design philosophy of these nationally had two elements. One was that some people did research that said that a flashing yellow arrow sends a clearer message that it's a left turn, but you have to yield condition than does the green ball from a 5-section signal head. So one part of it was a feeling that a flashing yellow was more intuitive than the 5-section heads that we were all used to. So I'm not even sure if I buy that argument, because even if you took a space alien and landed him in and said which one makes more sense, the flashing yellow would make more sense. But then again, we were all used to the other thing. But the other reason, and so we use them for that. We put them in new signals because it's thought to be a clear message that this is a permissive left turn. You can turn left if you yield. But the other big thing that they're supposed to be for is that they can be conditional. There are intersections where during the middle of the day, during the evening, early morning, late at night, whatever, it's perfectly safe to make a left turn on a permissive movement where oncoming traffic has the green. But during rush hour, the only people that are making that left, basically rush hour where the opposing through movement is saturated, and the only permissive left turns are either people squealing tires, shooting through a gap that they shouldn't even be trying, or they're going after the signal turns red. And so one thing that the 4-section head is really useful for is that you can change the left turn phasing based on conditions. It can be a time of day condition when you have that unsafe, saturated opposing through movement. You go to a protected only phasing rather than a permissive or a protected permissive. And I don't think that we're using them that way, and that's really what they're for. But the other thing that they can be used for is when you have a conflicting pedestrian call. So you can have a signal that allows a permissive left turn, but when that conflicting crosswalk is actuated, and typically that's going to be a minor movement, or major movement, but when that's actuated, then you go to a protected only phase, so you eliminate that pedestrian conflict. And we're not using them that way. And that being said, we've installed a bunch of them, so it would be a cheap fix. So maybe something that you all want to consider if you have these. So just to show you how that works, basically you get the green arrow, the solid yellow, and then the red, and then you can go to a flashing yellow. So it works. It can work like a protected permissive, it can work like a permissive only, or it can work like a protected only, depending on either time of day, traffic conditions, or what's going on with the pedestrian signal. Restricting turns on red is one thing we can do. I would argue if we could just get people to come to a complete stop before they turn right on red, that would be pretty good. That might be the first step. Get people to comply with the laws that exist. This is, again, sort of a unique case. Maybe you've got poor sight distance, bad sight triangles that you can't correct in the field. You could have just an unusual number of pedestrian conflicts out there. You've gone and observed it, and you've observed that this is an issue, a crash history maybe. If you have an exclusive pedestrian phase, this is what happens. But, we'd also want to look at things like a leading pedestrian interval would be another reason you would do. No right turn on red works well with a leading pedestrian interval because you're trying to create that hard gap so the pedestrians can get the right of way. This can be done at all times, usually not popular, or it can be when you've got that pedestrian push button call. These are really tough to enforce though. No turn on red when pedestrians are present requires, a police officer to both see the person make the right turn on red, observe that there were pedestrians present. It's just a tough thing to enforce. They can be by time of day. A real good time of day case is school zones, as an example where you might do that, or it could be, when the office is disgorging all of its people to walk across the street to the parking lot, or whatever, conditional. It can be actuated with LED. This is a little bit more expensive, and then you start getting into, what's the wind loading on the structure. It may become a pretty expensive project. We have a exclusive pedestrian phase. This is a pretty unique thing. Typically, you would do this in a downtown area where you have very high pedestrian volumes. And what you're really doing here is you're eliminating all pedestrian vehicle conflicts. So the pedestrians can go, and the pedestrians can go both, east, west, north, south, and also diagonally. No traffic can go, no turns on red. And then you have, your movements for your motor vehicles. So there's pros and cons to this. This is something you would see when you have really pedestrian crossing, serious pedestrian crossing volumes, creating real conflicts and delays with the motor vehicle volume because none of the turning traffic can go because there's always pedestrians in that crosswalk. And so then you just give up and you say, you know what, pedestrians go, cars go, two separate times. Again, most likely to find this in a downtown, maybe a university campus, very, very high volume locations. Pedestrians have to wait for both motor vehicle phases to go, but then again, they can cross diagonally, which can be an advantage. We kind of skip through these though. And obviously, when you eliminate all of your turning conflicts, you get a good crash reduction when you do that. Leading pedestrian interval, there may be more. The one I know about is in downtown Tampa on Ashley at Kennedy going across the bridge. These are things typically you find when you have a very, very heavy right turning volume. And what it does is you'll have a condition where you've got right turn on red, and then, that at that location, you have, it's a two-way street into a one-way street. And so you have a left turn movement you basically have drivers that are making an eastbound left turn. And so it's a very, very easy right turn on red movement there because there's, that eastbound left is really a major phase. So the drivers are making right turn on red, they're getting used to it. And then the southbound goes green and the drivers just keep turning right and the pedestrians never get a chance to go. And so this is basically like a miniature exclusive phase for the pedestrians. We'll see if this video plays. It's a little long.
pedestrian gets a walk sign, and they're able to enter the crosswalk, and then the cars get the green light. So the pedestrians at that point are well established in the crosswalk.
Now you notice the traffic is completely stopped as the walk sign goes on. So the pedestrians start first as the traffic stays still, like this lady crossing here, and they won't move for a whole 17 seconds.
All right, I'm going to stop there. 17 seconds, that's New York City coming off of a major bridge. The ones we'd have would typically be, 5 seconds or so. And so it's, a different thing. And it's basically 3 seconds, 5 seconds. It's not a major deal. And it's basically the same phasing plan, by the way, as the bus queue jump, which if we ever get bus rapid transit for real, then you could see, well, I think Central Avenue maybe, I don't know, we'll see what they do over there when they put the BRT in on Central Avenue in St. Pete. But the idea that at the same time you're giving the bus a jump, you're giving those pedestrians a jump too. Those typically are going to go together, lots of bus passengers, lots of pedestrians. And you can pull that 3 to 5 seconds off of whatever movement it makes sense to pull it off of. Typically it comes from a minor movement. So this just shows you again how that works. So there you go. If you do a leading pedestrian interval, you must do an accessible pedestrian signal, because the way visually impaired pedestrians know that they've got the walk is if there is no accessible signal, is that they're listening to the parallel traffic start moving. So they're listening to the cars, and they know therefore that they ought to be able to go if there is no accessible pedestrian signal. When you have the leading pedestrian interval, that traffic's not going to start moving, so they don't know that they have a walk signal, and then that creates a differential delivery of facilities, which is a conflict with ADA. So if you do an LPI, you must also do an accessible pedestrian signal, and I'll have to go down maybe later on at lunch and see if we've got that downtown in Tampa. I'm kind of speed through some of these. Okay. So hopefully now we know that traffic signals don't guarantee safety, and when you've got conflicting right and left turn movements, they can be pretty intimidating for pedestrians. The idea here was to show you some signal timing and phasing techniques to help make them a little bit more convenient, a little bit more intuitive, a little bit more safer, and hopefully then we get better outcomes for pedestrians at signals, and maybe even reduce the number of pedestrians crossing away from signalized locations because we've given them a value for moving to the signal. And then also talking about the major conflicts, why left turns are more deadly than right turns, but we need to consider both. And then looking at phasing and timing strategies to improve safety. I will mention one other thing. I think I started with this, but lighting at signalized intersections is key. If we're talking about, because DOT is going to come and spend millions of dollars to enhance lighting at state road arterial intersections. But there are a lot of big county roads and even some city streets where we also have to deal with this. Lighting is really critical. We see 40 or 50% of pedestrian crashes at night. Most pedestrian fatalities are at night. And when you're talking about those left and right turning movements, can't say enough about how important lighting is at signalized intersections. With that, I don't know if we've got questions in the chat pod or what you want to do here, Anthony.
There was one more follow-up on the Florida statute saying, read the statute. It specifies at signal-controlled intersections. And I think, I mean, it's just, we understand that the Florida statute is to stop for pedestrians and crosswalks. But in the MUTCD for that sign, the R10-15, that turning vehicles yield to pedestrians, there is no option for that sign. There isn't like a R10-15A, you know, where it's a stop for pedestrians and crosswalk. It's intended as a supplement to remind drivers that are making a right turn to yield to the pedestrians, and you know, by statute they have to yield by stopping to them. If not, they run them over. I mean, I'm not sure, you know, what else to say about that, other than that's just a sign that is in the MUTCD that allows us to remind pedestrians that there may, or drivers, that there may be a pedestrian there.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I would think that if it said stop for pedestrians and crosswalk, and then you've got a green signal, it would be, it may, I mean, you get the turn arrow, it sends a lot of messages. regardless, maybe I mean, MUTCD is not you know, carved in stone. Maybe in the next iteration they'll show the option. I don't know. I think that the net effect is the same, and frankly, people ought to be doing it anyway. This is something that you're just reinforcing or reminding what they ought to be doing.
I know that the in-road sign, that, you know, that the stop here for pedestrians or yield here for pedestrians, where you either do the stop bar or the yield triangles for the pavement, you know, that there's the options for those. And I know in Florida, everybody that is moving towards using the stop here for pedestrians because of that Florida statute. So I mean, it's optional to use one or the other, but to send a more clear message to the drivers in the case of a mid-block pedestrian crossing, I think the preferred is the stop here for pedestrians. One additional question, and that's regarding the, this is a little technical, the MUTCD W11-2 with the supplemental W16-7. That's the triangle that has the pedestrian walking with the down arrow.
Yeah.
The use of that at signalized intersections. How do you feel about that?
I don't think that's, I've not read what the MUTCD says verbally about where and where to put those. I've never seen it, and I don't think you need it. I think that most of those things are to support, supplement, and enhance crosswalks at unsignalized locations where the approach to the crosswalk is uncontrolled. I don't think you'd do that at a stop controlled location or signal controlled location where there's already the positive control for the motor vehicle. I don't know that, I'm not an MUTCD expert, so I don't know that it's prohibited. We can look that up. And do we have a place where we post after the fact questions in the website?
We've done it for a handful of them, but no.
Yeah, so I mean, we can look that up, and I can
follow with a question.
If it's not obvious in MUTCD, we could call a couple people and get an answer.
Because the Florida Intersection Design Guide matches the MUTCD in that it says that they should not be used.
Right.
I don't think it's a shall, it's a kind of like a but that wording is apparently disappearing in the upcoming design manual. So they're kind of, I mean, the person that's posting the question says that they find it distracting.
I think it would be good in general for the program if you and Dennis had these were follow-up research things and then tag it back to that seminar. So those are two things we can, I know a lot of folks at Federal Highway and people that are on the committees for MUTCD, so we can just ask that question. And I'll ask the other question about the R1015. I don't know. I've never thought about it. We were happy to get the yield and stuff.
And then the follow-up to that is also on the far side of the intersection. You have a crosswalk near side and a crosswalk far side.
Right.
If you put it near side, should you then also put it far side, pedestrian? It's just, it's a lot of signs.
So we'll kind of track that down and see if there's a prohibition or if somebody else thinks it's a good idea or whatever, and we can kind of put that out there. So.
Yeah, right now there's no other questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but Dennis and I will stay on the line. If anything else comes up, we'll try to follow up. Thank you. Thank you.
Damien, thank you so much.
Bye.